uncles, teachers, anybody listening that is walking children through sexuality. Welcome. We are so glad you're here. This is week 1 of Parent Well, and we are going to be talking about the home you had growing up. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, I'm here to learn how to parent my children through their sexuality. Why are we talking about me? Well, Jason and I, this is my husband, Jason, we're going to talk today about how big of a deal it is to actually take a look at where we've come from in our own lives and in our own histories in order to parent our kids well. The leader that we are in our home is absolutely representing the person that we were growing up, the child that was raised. We bring all of that to the table of conversation, and it actually creates a lens that we look through that helps us determine what we think about sexuality, how we parent our kids. And unless we chart a different course, we're going to kind of repeat some of the same things that we experienced as young people. So it's a big deal that we would unpack this a little bit today.
Yeah, I'm excited. I really feel like people are going to get major breakthrough, even in this first session, just looking at your life, hearing our story, and kind of unpacking what life was like for you. So we want you to walk out of this feeling so equipped to bring your kids something that maybe you never got.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's interesting, right? Because we can look at life, we can look at the people around us. I'm sure we've all had these experiences where we encounter individuals who grew up in a certain level of normal. Maybe they grew up in an abusive home. Maybe they grew up in a home without a dad. Maybe they grew up in a home where they were actually raised by their grandparents. Whatever was normal for them. We all experience some level of trauma, and we all learn to cope in different ways when we're kids. Well, how many people have you met in this life who have said, I grew up in an abusive home and I swore I would never repeat what happened to me. Yet 10 years into marriage, they find themselves in an abusive marriage, or their current home life really actually looks a lot like where they came from. And you wonder, how does this happen? How does somebody swear not to make something happen? And here we are.
Or maybe even not like so on the abusive spectrum, like my parents grew up disconnected. I'm going to have a marriage that's super connected, or I'm never going to, I'm always going to be present with my kids. And then growing up, you see that, I'm repeating the same thing that I actually lived.
Absolutely.
So we want to help you guys learn a new way of living life and doing life.
Yep. We don't want to assume that you grew up in an unhealthy culture of sex. I think what's more common than not is that we would hope to be able to do things even better and more wholeheartedly and healthily even than where we came from. I think that that's even biblical, to go from glory to glory, that we want our kids' generation to live in standards above where we came from. That's normal. So we're learning and growing in this journey. And as people who have become parents or who are raising children, it's really important to know, in order to go to the next level with our kids, we have to know where we started. So I want to introduce a couple pieces of language for you. It's going to help you as you kind of assimilate some of this information and think about your own journey. We want to introduce some language. If you're familiar with Moral Revolution material, if you've read any of the Moral Revolution books or even blog articles, you might be familiar with this language already. But I'm going to introduce you to 3 types of cultures of sex that you encountered as a young person, whether you realize it or not, and your children are encountering these cultures, whether you realize it or not. So putting some language to it, Jason and I are going to unpack it a little bit, give you a couple illustrations to understand it before we move on. The first is a silent culture of sex. If you have encountered a silent culture of sex, I'm going to use an illustration that actually Havilah Cunnington came up with. I think it's brilliant. A silent culture of sex, imagine a bedroom door that's closed all the way. It's locked. You don't know what's behind the door. It's surrounded by mystery. You actually are just left to your imagination. Nobody explains what's behind the door. A culture of sex in silence, it's leaving a lot to the imagination. And the problem with that is that kids fill in the gaps. Kids fill in the gaps. So if you grew up in a culture where sex wasn't discussed or talked about at all, you were left to imagine it was either not very important or it was too private to talk about. Leaves a lot up to the imagination and you fill in the gaps. What's the next one?
In the saturated culture of sex, imagine that the door is open all the time. and you can go in, you can go out, and usually in a saturated culture of sex, sex is introduced in jokes. It's not sacred. It's not really taught about in a healthy way. It's just, it's
Experienced.
everywhere. Yeah, it's experience. And so in those cultures, kids don't learn how valuable it is. You actually learn that it's everywhere. It's not very valuable. Everyone sees it. And it's just this thing that we experience day in and day out.
Right.
And I would say that a lot of high schoolers, a lot of kids grow up in a saturated culture of sex where it's on TV all the time.
Yeah.
It's the one night stands. It's all the stuff that you probably are trying to keep your kids from seeing day in and day out.
Absolutely. Yeah, the saturated culture is what you're going to find in the world, right? Usually not in our homes. If we're growing up in a Christian home, that's not necessarily the normal we've created. It might be the normal you've come from. In a silent culture, I should say, you know, we're going to find that in the church a lot, unfortunately. I know I grew up in a silent culture in my home. Anyways, the third piece of language we want to introduce you to is the concept of a conflicted sexual culture. Now, this is really common because I think that it's actually, most adults want to establish a sense of healthy sexuality in their home with their children, but a conflicted culture of sex happens where basically that bedroom door swings open and closed. You get a peek, you have maybe an experience, and then the door closes because you learn at church or from your parents or from a teacher that that's actually not for now. We're going to wait. Sex is for marriage. It's going to be great someday, but it's not for now. But you know, you're 15, right? And you've got hormones. So you have this experience with a boyfriend or a girlfriend, and you're all of a sudden awakened to something about the realm of sexuality, but you know that it's not pure. You're confused about what's okay, what's not okay. And basically you just kind of hope that you're going to make the right decisions and that it's going to work out. So that doesn't cover all the bases, but that language should help you kind of think through what were my experiences of sexual culture growing up, and potentially what are my kids experiencing now?
Yeah, I think that it's important to realize the law of first mention. I don't know that we've talked about that at all.
It's great, yeah.
But whoever teaches you something for the very first time, in your mind, that becomes the authority on that message. And so, for instance, in a silent home like where you grew up in, your friends taught you about sex, and culture taught you about sex and the truth about it. Therefore, when someone else comes to teach you about it, or like when a real teacher comes to teach you, you go, no, I don't know if you're true because I actually learned it over here unconsciously. So it's really important that we take the initiative and be the first person to teach our kids about sex or any important topic, because we then become the authority. And when the other people, when culture comes in and says, no, sex is really this saturated thing. Sex is awesome. It's this thing that you could do with anyone, anytime. If you taught your kids, no, it's actually this sacred thing, but we're not ashamed of it, they start to go, nah, you guys aren't the authority. My parents are the authority. So it's important to be the first people out of the gate if you can.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And we're going to talk more about that in the weeks to come. Another thing we're going to mention later on is that really the arena of sexual development in your children, it is about character development. So there's a lot of character development that happens in these early years of children's lives. We're going to talk more about age-based conversations later, and you're going to hear from some experts on the subject. But when we're talking about being exposed to different cultures of sex, we're talking about what is shaping the character of your children. What shaped your character when you were young and you were encountering these silent, saturated, and or conflicted cultures of sex? It's helping develop a character framework inside of you as a human being. And, you know, when we become parents ourselves, it's very natural to take a look and go, what pieces of this framework do I need to actually tear down and rebuild? Or what pieces of this framework are actually beautiful and part of a rich heritage that I bring to the table of conversation with my kids? It's not all bad. We're not just undoing. There should be a lot of validating that happens. But in order to help you parents, all of you who are raising these wonderful kids, kind of think through your own life and evaluate the different environments that you grew up in and how it contributed to your character development in the area of sexuality. Jason and I are going to unpack a little bit of our own history for you. When it comes to the environments of our homes, these are the environments that really impact us. Our homes, our churches or communities, right? Some of you didn't grow up in church, but you were a part of sports teams or dance companies, or you had communities of people in your neighborhood that you're running with. So our homes, our communities and churches, and then our life experiences that really shape us. So as Jason and I unpack a little bit about our own histories for you, we really want to inspire you to think through your own past, even if it's a little bit painful, so that you can take an honest assessment about where you've come from and what the framework is that you've built. So the first environment that we're going to talk about, we're going to kind of unpack our own stories for you a little bit, is the environment of the home. And Jason and I could not have grown up in more different homes, let me tell you. So why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about Weaverville.
Oh man. So I grew up in a small mountain town of 3,000, and it's just a completely different world than Charleston, South Carolina.
Yeah.
Where everything's proper, you know. My parents, they are first generation Christians, and they really try to do everything by the book with love. And so my dad was super open about sexuality, what's happening in my body, and didn't really hide anything. Like I remember even to like a negative, almost a negative, like even nudity in my house was pretty normal. Yeah. Pretty normal. Or my dad would walk out in his underwear, even having my friends over.
He might still do that.
Yeah, he probably does that.
He might still do that.
But I can actually remember being like 12 or 13 years old, driving home from Reading, which is like a 45-minute drive from Reading to Weaverville. And my dad asked me, hey, do you know what masturbation is? And I did know what masturbation was, because of my friends, I think at that time, but I remember breaking out in like cold sweats. And he said, have you struggled with masturbation before? And everything inside of me wanted to just open the door and eject out of the car. But my dad, every time I'd get in the car, my dad, probably about 11 to 15, 16, my dad would ask me how I'm doing. You know, he wanted to talk about girls. He wanted to talk about how my feelings were, and I was just like, oh, every time I'd be like, oh, get me out of this car. But the beautiful side was I knew I never had to hide.
Yeah.
And sexuality was this incredible topic that I got to share with my parents.
Yeah.
And so it, as we'll find out in a little bit, like it really helped me process through life and start out well.
Yeah. Yeah. On the contrary, like you said, I did. I grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, in a very proper southern city. My family actually is originally from the Midwest, so we didn't have quite the level of like, I mean, I did go to Cotillion, don't get me wrong. Like I definitely did.
They probably don't even know what Cotillion is.
Hey, some of you do. You know if you know. I grew up in a home, I'm the only girl in my family and I'm the oldest child. So I like to say that I'm kind of the experiment in my home, but I really gave my parents like an easy time because by nature, I like to follow the rules. I'm very much a like cross your T's and dot your I's kind of a person. So my parents had it pretty easy with their firstborn, I gotta say. But you know, I grew up in a home where I wasn't talked to about sex one time. Never, not one time. Now, I will say we were able to watch shows on TV together as a family that talked about sex. I could listen to almost any music I wanted. I grew up knowing the Lord and absolutely loving God, but didn't fully have a relationship with Jesus till much later. I grew up in the Catholic Church, so it was different. There was a reverence for God and it was absolutely a part of our life. But my parents weren't like reading me scripture at night or talking to me about the Bible's, view of sexuality or what was happening to me in my body. None of it. I'll tell you what, we, in the South, you may or may not know that every late summer to early fall is hurricane season. And I'm actually just remembering this as we're talking. This is actually awesome. So we had to evacuate our city. Like our family packed up the car, got in the car, drove up to North Carolina, and we stayed with like a cousin's cousin or something. I have no idea. I'm in the bathroom and I'm looking for like a towel or something. And I open up the bathroom cabinet and there's a children's book in the cabinet that's all about sex. It's like a children's book for kids about sex. And I thought to myself, what in the world? This would have been really helpful like 6 years ago. Why don't we have this book at my house? And I totally flipped through it and I'm thinking, wow, okay, this is contrary to anything that I've really, all the assumptions I've had to make as a young person. You know, I'm probably in junior high school at this time. All the assumptions I've made, I'm like, wow, I wish I could steal this book and take it home because I'm pretty sure I don't have enough time to read it between now and when I'm supposed to be out of the shower. But I remember thinking, this is cool that they have this book in their home. I've never one time been talked to about sex.
Yeah.
So what I want to, the picture I want to paint is basically, my parents didn't tell me what to do by any stretch. They also didn't tell me what not to do.
Yeah.
Any music was allowed. Any TV shows were allowed.
Just
I was
culture
at school
was
with friends.
culture
Culture
really
was culture.
shaping you. Yeah.
Culture was normal in our home. And I really wasn't parented through my sexuality at all. So you might find yourself on any end of that spectrum or even further to one of the extremes. But the culture of our home is very shaping for us, very shaping. The second culture that we would kind of unpack for you with our own journeys would be that of our church or community. So talk to us about that.
Yeah, I mean, community was almost the same in that because it was such a small town and a small church that I grew up in, you know, our church was about 250 people, and my dad was one of the leaders at the church and youth group. We really got to shape, you know, what happened there. And so kind of our church and our community embraced the vulnerability, authentic, honest type of living. And so, man, my life was inundated with, this is what the Bible says about our sexuality. This is what my parents say. This is what my friends are going through. I mean, it wasn't a secret. And it was so helpful because I didn't even know that other kids had to hide that kind of stuff.
Right.
I didn't know that other kids didn't know what happened and especially what was going on in your body and why you felt a certain way. I can remember dating and my dad just being like, it's normal to want to kiss. It's normal to want to hold hands. It's normal to, like, where other kids that didn't get these conversations were struggling with, like, is something wrong with me?
Yeah.
My dad was saying, these things are normal. Manage it like this. Even to the point where I was dating someone for a long time, and I remember I didn't have any feelings for them anymore. And my dad was like, oh, let's talk about that. Let's talk about how feelings work and when they come and when they go. It was just like so helpful to be in an environment, in a culture. But that stuff was taught from the stage.
Yeah.
That was taught in our youth group. That was taught in our environment.
So helpful.
Yeah, super helpful.
So helpful. Again, cannot say that that's where I've come from. And I would be willing to bet that that's not where the majority of us have come from. My church and community, you know, like I said, I grew up Catholic. And so we went to church on Sundays and we went to confession when we missed church. That was pretty much it. And you know, luckily when I was a freshman in high school, I kind of fell into this group, you know, again, South Carolina. So the Southern Baptist youth group in our town was like the coolest youth group to go to. And all my friends were a part of it. So of course I begged my parents to let me go to this crazy Southern Baptist youth group. And I would say that's the community where I first experienced like an intentionality towards helping teenagers navigate their sexual development. But I would say it was definitely in the conflicted category of sexual culture because, you know, the youth leaders would present like, hey, we're married. We've been married for a couple of years now. Sex is awesome. It's for marriage. But you are not allowed to cross these lines. Like, it is a sin to make out with your boyfriend. It is wrong to, you know, touch each other inappropriately. But marriage is awesome and sex is amazing when you're married, and just wait until you get there someday. And there wasn't a lot of practical help to navigate, like, well, I do have a boyfriend and we do have all these raging hormones. And so what are we actually protecting, and what's the beautiful gift that we're fighting
It
for?
was just
And
a lot of like do
it
and
was a
don't.
lot of rules, right?
Yeah.
It's a lot of wait until you get to marriage, it's going to be awesome. In the meantime, here's a list of rules to follow and what not to do. Like, that's not inspiring for
Yeah.
a 15-year-old kid. That's like boring and also just really unhelpful.
Yeah.
So they had probably incredible intentions, and potentially other people in the group, maybe they had very different experiences, because maybe at home it was also being filtered through these
Yeah.
other lenses. Who knows? But for me, that was my experience. I grew up with a very kind of confused, I
Mhm.
understand that this is off limits, but I don't actually know what I'm doing in the process. That was my church and community. I will say I'm grateful to have grown up at minimum inside of a community that did value purity to some degree. I'm like, it's kind of nice I didn't make more mistakes. I mean, I'm glad that I wasn't just out doing anything. But yeah, it's challenging to kind of navigate that if you don't have
Yeah.
the structure at home. The third place that kind of shapes us, the third maybe category of environments that shape our sexual identity, would just be those of our experiences, right? Like, we've all had a variety of experiences. They might
Mhm.
have nothing to do with your home or your community or your church, but maybe stuff just happens. And like Jason said, the law of first mention, like, your experience and what you feel in a first time moment is often the written rule for you, whether or not it is contrary to the truth that your pastor gives you, or your parent gives you,
Mhm.
or your friend gives you. And our experiences really do shape us. I would say
Yeah.
Jason and I both had
So true.
a variety of sexual experiences that really shaped us as people.
Yeah. So growing up, I was a really curious young boy, and I think probably like any normal average boy. But I found masturbation at a very young age, about 10 years old. Became completely addicted to that. I found pornography at 14 with church friends. Was
Classic.
introduced. Yeah. Like most kids are introduced very, very
Right.
young. I think the average age right now is 11 or 12 that kids are introduced to porn. And had oral sex actually when I was really young,
Mhm.
like 10 or 11 years old. And those were all experiences that really shaped my life. All my sexual experiences until I was 16 were with guys.
Mhm.
But the coolest thing was I didn't hide any of it. So I remember, you know, the experience I had with oral sex. I remember coming home. I didn't know it was wrong. I didn't even know what it was or what it was called. I just remember feeling bad, like guilty,
Mhm.
and coming home and being like, oh, I got to tell my dad. And so I explained to him what I had done. And to this day, he says that he said more to me, but all I remember him saying is like, hey, you're really curious. That's not something you need to do anymore. There wasn't any shame. He wasn't like, oh my gosh, boys aren't supposed to do that with
Yeah.
boys, and you're not supposed to do that until you're married. Like, none of that talk. It was just, hey, you're really curious.
Yeah.
That's not what we do. With the masturbation and the pornography, like, I worked through those years with my dad, and then how I eventually broke free is my dad one night said, hey, what do you think about telling the family? I'd
Mhm.
been stuck in pornography for about a year, and 14 to 15. And I said, oh, you think it'll help? You know, I'm the youngest boy, and I have two older sisters and a mom. And so
So
he was,
telling the families
yeah,
sounds so fun.
telling the family was like, I didn't have like four older brothers. And I said, do you think it'll help? He said, I don't think it'll hurt. And I told my family, like, this is what I'm struggling with. You know, I'm struggling looking at naked women. And my sisters and my mom got up and they just surrounded me and they started loving on me and praying for me. And I just
So
remember crying
powerful.
that night, feeling so accepted. And that was the beginning of me walking out
Yeah. The
of
breakthrough.
this thing that I'd been so stuck in. In my home, you know, again, even though I had probably experienced I had more sexual experiences than probably most of my friends,
Mhm.
and even you, I would
Yeah.
say, growing
Yeah.
up, because it was so open in my family and healthy, and I didn't have to hide, it didn't actually negatively affect me,
Yep. Yeah.
long lasting, long
Yeah.
term.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that that's really profound. Like, we can have pretty awful sexual experiences, and if we're led through them
Hmm.
effectively and with love,
Yeah.
it doesn't actually have to be a damaging experience,
Yeah.
which is really interesting.
Super cool.
I'd say my experiences growing up, because I wasn't really parented or led in my journey of sexuality, I was really marked by the experiences that I had. And unlike Jason, I didn't have a great sounding board. I didn't have help along the way. I was filling in a lot of gaps myself. So when I was 15 years old and started going to the Southern Baptist Youth Group, I also met a boy that became my boyfriend. I dated him all 4 years of high school. And then when I went into college, I never didn't have a boyfriend. And then when I graduated from college, I rarely didn't have a boyfriend. So
See a pattern here?
yeah.
Something going on?
Basically I'm like, I know this like boyfriend girlfriend thing is supposed to be how it works. I'm just gonna figure it out, I suppose. Like we're just gonna ride this ride. So, you know, what I learned as a 15-year-old was, okay, this feels good. I feel loved. I feel accepted. I also feel needed. I feel like he wants more from me than I should probably give him, but I'm finding a lot of acceptance here. And we have a deep connection, both spiritually, emotionally, and also sexually. We never had intercourse. I was a virgin when I got married, but I might as well have. You know what I'm saying? Like there wasn't a lot of other things we didn't do. And so I sat in that conflict my entire teenage and young adult life and had to just kind of sort it out day by day, figure out like, how do I manage the shame that I feel with this call that I have on my life for purity and this mystery of like, I know I'm supposed to be protecting this thing, but I feel very caught up in a snowball of, you know, relationship emotions that just kind of spiral you down a path, whether you want it to or not. And so my sexual experiences shaped me because I had to learn how to look proper and healthy while dealing with a lot of confusion on the inside. I got really good at looking like I had it all together, and I was processing a ton of pain and confusion inside of myself. Honestly, until I moved to Reading and became a BSSM student. And I wasn't struggling with some of the same patterns anymore, but the confusion and the frustration that I'd been walking with for years and years didn't get unpacked until my early 20s.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I feel like as we've kind of shared a little bit of our story, some of you are probably thinking through your own. And like I said before, you're kind of finding yourself on the spectrum and you're recalling some memories. And sometimes that can be humorous. Sometimes, you know, it'll bring up a little chuckle.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's actually really painful to think about the places we've come from and the environments that shaped us. And, you know, I want to kind of put a bow on this by explaining like, how has this affected us as parents? You know, we're going to talk in the next lesson about kind of the fruit of our roots. But for the purpose of this conversation, I want to kind of show you a little bit of, you know, how did our history take us to this place? How did it set Jason up as a parent versus me? And I'll start with me and I'll just say, so when Jason and I got married and I became a stepmom to his 3 kids, I knew right away I never wanted our kids to deal with the level of confusion and ambiguity that I walked in my teenage years. But I had no idea where to begin because nobody had modeled it for me. That sent me kind of on a journey of figuring out how to be powerful in this parenting scenario. But ultimately, I relied a lot on Jason because he had a great model.
Yeah, and I would say I had a really good foundation and some tools, but for me, even learning how to parent has been an ever-growing journey
Absolutely.
for me. I think from my past, what it really did was help me go, oh gosh, I know how important and how helpful it was to have parents be open and even to have those experiences in my life and to be able to share them. How do I model that for my kids and get through my own personal fear of having those conversations and even sometimes feeling inadequate to have those conversations? Okay, what do I need to do to even improve upon what my parents gave me? And so I think that that's really the journey that we've been on and kind of why we're doing this is to break that off and give it to them.
Absolutely. And This is a lot to assimilate. This is a lot of information, and it's only week one. So, as we explained in the introduction, every week you're going to have the opportunity to engage in some homework. And this week is no different. We're excited to send you off to have some processing time of your own. And there's a couple things we want you to think through. Firstly, we want you to look back on this language that we presented you, this language of the silent, saturated, and conflicted sexual cultures. Some of these experiences started a long time ago. Write down as early as you can remember the experiences that you had in sexuality and jot them down, like all the way through your growing up years. Take some time to think about them and process them. And, in the next session, we're actually going to talk about the fruit of some of these experiences that we've had, the fruit that shows up in our lives even as adults. So we'll walk you through a little bit about what to do with some of that. But for this week, we really want you to just kind of take note.
Yeah, I think one thing that might be helpful for people is to actually verbalize. If you have a friend or if you're married and you're watching this, to go through and just talk through, hey, what happened? What was your life like? What were your experiences like? What really did shape you? Because as even you see and I see, even sharing this, I remember like, oh, this thing happened. And to be able to dialogue, asking somebody else, like, how do you think that affected me? And have you seen that? Like, we really want you to get familiar with your story to the point where you're not afraid of it, you're not ashamed of it. It's just really good information that you can now decide, okay, have I helped it? Have I healed it? Is it affecting me?
Yeah.
And how am I going to parent?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Well, you guys, we have come to the end of week one. Congratulations, parents. You are on the journey and we are with you in it. We're so glad that you decided to be a part of this course with us. Listen, you are brave and courageous. This is a big deal that we're learning to parent our kids by going back and actually taking a look at our own lives. This is huge. So well done. Stick with us. We are so excited to see you next week.